Okay. Good morning. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Another early start. My name's Eric Wishart. I'm the Vice President of the club. I also work with ARP News Agency. So before I introduce the speakers today, I'd just like to say a couple of things. This is being live streamed on Facebook. Also, this is our third of our workshops. And in a couple of weeks' time, we'll do another one, either on first aid and or covering mental health and suicide. So that's still in the works. So we'll send the notice out within a week. This morning, well, last night actually, we delivered a letter to the Hong Kong Police Commissioner, Stephen Low, expressing our concern about the relations between the media and the Hong Kong police, and suggesting a list of measures that the police could take to improve the situation. And we expressed concern particularly about the use of tear gas, which has become pretty random, and a lot of people have been affected by it also in their homes, so we talked about that. So we sent it last night, and we'll post it on the website this morning and on social media. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Lokman Tsui, from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, expert on digital security, which is absolutely critical issue for us. So he'll be doing a presentation on that, and moderating it, Shelley Banjo, who's a technology writer at Bloomberg. So thank you. And we'll have time for, as usual, a Q&A afterwards. So I think, Lokman, you'll probably talk maybe half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we can take it through. I mean, as like the last 2 weeks, I think the time we were going to finish was 9, but we can roll over till 9:15 or so. Okay, thank you.
Can you hear us okay?
Test, hello.
Great. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We talk a lot about physical security here already with a couple of panels and legal security, and the next kind of iteration we wanted to talk about is digital security. And it seems a little amorphous to many of us, but in this day and age, we want to kind of emphasize that everybody at this point could be listening in to your phone calls, to your text messages, and it's not to scare you. It's more to make you aware of kind of the realities that we live in, and especially as journalists, politicians, anyone dealing with anything, particularly sensitive, should be on a little bit of a higher alert. So Lokman here is an extreme expert at this kind of stuff, and as he'll tell you, this stuff is always changing. So he might give you a presentation today, and it could completely evolve by next week. But as I told him, we're kind of in this moment of time where we want to get some equip our folks with some skills today. So he'll do his best at that. But I wanted to kind of start off with that caveat. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for being so early to have a talk on digital security. I'm a geek, so I'm very excited about that topic, but I also learned that that's not a topic most people get really excited about most of the time, although it's an important topic, as Shelley has said. As I'm a professor at the School of Journalism at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. My primary interest is really freedom of speech, and that's how I approach the topic of digital security too. I'm not necessarily per se interested in security per se in itself, much more so how it implicates and what kind of consequences and effects it has on the way we communicate with each other and the freedom that comes with that. Previous research I've done is on internet censorship, including in China, also on personal data protection and surveillance, and how that impacts our freedom of speech, when we're constantly being watched. My dissertation, my PhD dissertation, is actually on journalism theory. So I'm glad to be here. I used to be at Google, working at the public policy team there, leading their free expression efforts in Asia and Pacific. And so that's a little bit of my background. If you're wondering what my accent is, it's Dutch. So I was born and raised in Amsterdam in Holland. My parents are from Hong Kong, although my students say that my English is starting to get a more local accent at this point. If I talk too fast, let me know. If there's anything, especially technical, that I don't explain well enough, also let me know. With that, I was wondering if I could get a quick sense of what the audience is like. So, how many of you here are reporters or journalists? And how many would identify with being more on a manager level, editor level, and so on? Okay. How many are lawyers? Okay, a few. And how many are IT people? And all right, so we need a few more IT people in the room at some point, I guess, actually, one more question. How many of you have been to a security workshop, digital security workshop before? Okay, a few hands. So before, I guess let's get started. And as Shelley said, this is not going to be a really comprehensive list of things you need to think about or do, but these are some of the most important things I think you need to think about. But the list is endless at this point and ever changing. And so I will at the end also give you some resources you can turn to. But let me walk you through 3 typical attacks that we have seen over the years, but especially in the last couple of weeks, and what you want to think about and how you want to prepare yourself against these attacks. So the most obvious one here in Hong Kong is a physical access to your phone, right? When the police comes and gets your phone, like arrest you and ask you for access to your phone. The second one I want to talk about is spear phishing. I don't know how many of you actually are familiar with that term, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then sort of more broadly, digital surveillance and what you can do about that. So, like we've seen the police arresting protesters in the last couple of weeks, and the police convincing the protester to actually give up their phone. One, they don't have to do that, but 2, they only don't have to do that if they have turned off Face ID and Touch ID, because you technically or you legally you have the right to remain silent, right, to not self-incriminate, but that means not giving up any knowledge that might incriminate you. And so a PIN code is knowledge that you have, you know that, right? And so you don't have to give that up. On the contrary, Face ID and Touch ID, which is recognizing your fingerprint or recognizing your facial features, is not knowledge. And so that's not something you know. And so what happened, this is a particular sort of horrifying story to me, but the New York Times covered this. They arrested a protester and they pinned down the person and to try to match the phone with the face to unlock the phone. My advice would be to turn off Face ID and Touch ID, turn on PIN code, and also turn on a feature called, like where they erase the data if you have 10 unsuccessful PIN attempts. Because otherwise, if they have the phone, they can infinitely try out the PIN, and that doesn't take that much effort. And so, but if they only have 10 attempts, then it would be a lot more difficult.
And
you can do this in the settings, right?
Yeah. You can do this in the settings of your phone, right?
Yes. There's also a quick trick. If you press your power button 5 times really quickly, it will also turn off Face ID and Touch ID. So if you get arrested, you haven't, you can remember this, by the way. So which, you might not if you're getting arrested, or getting integrated. But if you press 5 times the power button really fast, that will also basically lock the phone. And this is important because once they get the phone, it's game over, right? They have access to everything in your phone. And so that's why I wanted to start with this example first. This spear phishing, let me explain what spear phishing is actually. So this is a technical term, and it's there are 2 things there, right? Phishing and spear, and the word spear. So phishing attempts are attempts by hackers or any person with bad intentions to try to get information about you. And so they're phishing for you. And so that can be for all kinds of purposes. Like they want to have your credit card information, they want to be able to log into your email accounts, and so on. And often these are for commercial purposes. They just want to, steal your money, and so on and so on. Spear phishing is a specific variation of the normal phishing attacks, where they're really specifically interested in you. So that's where the spear part comes in. It's very targeted. Normal phishing attempts don't care. So these are that works like spam. Like they send it out to many people. They might get one or two gullible people back, who think they're really pretending to be who they are, and then give them the password and so on. But spear phishing is different because they know that you're a journalist, they know you're a legislator, they know you're someone important, and then so they customize also the message that they're trying to trick you with very, very specifically. And so, for example, if you're a journalist, you've been working on a story on, say, Google, they might lead with an email, crafted, like, hey, I know you're working on a story in Google. I'm an insider there. I have a breaking news story that, will shock the world. Here, open the attachment for, all the, confidential email between, Larry Page and so on, You're a journalist, right? So, your job is to look at that stuff. And then so the same happened with a lot of politicians, legislators, and so on. And so we've seen a rise in these kind of attacks over the last couple of weeks in Hong Kong too. And the goal here is to either take over your device or your account remotely. So this is different from the trying to get physical access to your phone. This is done remotely always. So this reaches you. You either get an SMS or you get an email that tells you all this stuff, and you're supposed to click on a link or you're supposed to open an attachment that then will allow the hacker to get into your phone or into your account. Sometimes it can also simply be the precursor to these kind of attacks. And so sometimes it might seem innocent, where, like it doesn't seem like they're trying to hack your account, but then what they're trying to do is just a recon. They're trying to figure out more information about your organization, about who your boss is, what the structure looks like, of your organization and so on, because then they can customize the second email that then will target your account, okay? So this works really well because oftentimes the human being is the weakest link in security. So, you can set up all the technical protections in place that you need, but if you as a human being, you still end up clicking on that thing, then they win, right? And so this is also why this requires you to be a little bit more vigilant, be a little bit more careful. When you get emails like that, and I'll talk a little bit about what you need to do at that point. But obviously, don't like if you're suspicious, ask an expert. What's going on here. And this is where I think the news organization or the FCC could play a role in, because sometimes you don't know who to ask, right? And then also what's really important is if you found something like this, make sure that your friends, your colleagues know about it, because probably they're also being targeted. They probably also got the same email. And then so, that's really important. That's a social aspect of it, of how you can protect yourself and your friends and others.
I was just going to say, I think you bring up an interesting point, which is even though you might not have anything to hide, you're giving your word to your sources or your colleagues that what you're talking about will remain confidential. And if you type up all this stuff and somebody gets it, then you no longer are keeping your word to keep things confidential.
Yeah, thank you for emphasizing that. Because obviously, if you give, if they get access to your account and your device, then they have access to all your networks, all your emails, and so on. So the really best tip is to be really vigilant, actually. Like when you suspect something, make sure that, you run it through an expert. But in general, and this is also difficult, but always make sure your apps and your OS is up to date. Because Apple and the other phone companies oftentimes make security fixes. But if you don't update your phone, then you don't get them. And I know for many reasons people don't update their things because they like the look of that one app, or something like that, but it's really, really important from a security point of view that you keep your stuff up to date. The other thing that I want to highlight is two-factor authentication. And I want to ask the crowd here, how many of you actually have heard of this or are using two-factor authentication? Okay. Most, but not all. And so this should really be all, especially amongst this crowd. Like this two-factor authentication at this point is just good practice for anyone, I would say, but especially for people that work in sort of at-risk, jobs, like being journalists. So two-factor authentication is simply the idea that you have an account, your email account, right? And instead of having one lock, you have two locks on your account. So your first lock is your password, something you know, and then your second lock in this, is something that you have, only you have. So that could be your mobile device, okay? And so online banking has that. So if you do online banking and you try to transfer money to an account, obviously you have to log into your account to prove that it's really you. But at the moment when you try to wire some money, they will ask you oftentimes to show that you have a device that the bank gave you, with an arbitrary number that changes every time. But that's something you have, only you have, right? And so that's a two-factor authentication, two levels of verifying that's really, really you. When it comes to two-factor authentication, there are different ways to do that. A very popular way is to get an SMS, the same way you have a banking device that gives you the number. Don't use SMS because it's unsafe at this point. Especially if you're being targeted by a state actor, which journalists most of the time are, then if you use SMS, the point of vulnerability is the telecommunication company because they can intercept the SMS. And we have examples not in Hong Kong, but in the Middle East and other countries where that's exactly what happened. The state worked with the telecommunication company to intercept the SMS messages that were intended to provide two-factor authentication. So what you want to do is there are apps on your phone that serve that function, and then so you can install that app, and that will provide the number for you. And then so that app doesn't go through the telecommunication company, so then they cannot intercept it. And the added benefit of that app is also it will work even if you have no connection, right? The SMS, obviously you need to have a working phone connection. The app will work even if you have it in airplane mode.
What's a good app?
There's Google Authenticator. There's another one called Authy, like A-U-T-H-Y, that you can look into and use. I recommend, both are great. So benefit of Authy is that you can transfer when you change phones. It's a little bit more difficult with Google Authenticator. If you change phones, then you wanna, that's a problem then, right? Because basically the key is becomes your phone. So then you want to have an app that also that you can say, oh, this is now my new key. Any questions up until this point? Okay, let me move on. So digital surveillance. This is when you're talking to your sources, right? So this is sort of one-on-one communication that I'm talking about. You always want to use end-to-end encryption. For those who don't know what that is, or who don't know the difference between end-to-end communication, end-to-end encryption and normal encryption, your email is encrypted, right? If you use Gmail, if you use Hotmail, if you use any email, it's all encrypted. Meaning, if I send an email to Shelly, Shelly can obviously read it, I can read it, but also the email provider can read it, whoever facilitates the email, right? So this is like in the case of if you use Gmail, right? Google can read your emails. And you need to know that, by the way. I don't know if you know that, but like they do that not by having human beings read it. So let me clarify that, but they, the fact that Gmail runs on on ads, for example, is because they have scripts that go through the and then can target you. Okay. The difference. So what that means is, this is why Snowden of revelations were so shocking, is it's Shelley knows this, I know, I can read the email, but also Google, right? And so that means that the platform provider, the email provider in this case, also is a potential vulnerability point. And so the state can go to Google, they can go to Facebook, they can go to Twitter and so on and say, hey, Shelley, journalist, broke the story that, but that's now, we suspect, there's dangerous stuff going on. We want to know who she's been talking to. She's not going to give up her sources, but she runs on Gmail, and so on. Okay, Google probably will push back. I hope they will push back. When I was there, we would have pushed back. But you don't want to be dependent on that, right? And so this is why end-to-end encryption is important. So end-to-end encryption means that even the middleman, the intermediary, the platform, doesn't know what Shelley and I are talking about. So this is, when Apple, for example, got harassed by the FBI was it 2 years ago, I think, at this point? It's because, iMessage, for example, is end-to-end encrypted. So Apple can say, even I don't know what's going on, I don't have the key for this, and then so if you are working, if you're talking with sources, this becomes really, really important. On top of the actual substance of the communication, that obviously can be really sensitive and that you want to protect. Something else you want to protect is the metadata around it. And so metadata is a technical term for basically information about information. And so it's not the actual content of what Shelley and I are discussing, but when we discuss this, how often we talk, at what time, what phone we use maybe to discuss things, and so on. Okay?
So it could see like that I called you at 7 p.m. and then maybe after calling you 10 times, they can start to put the picture
so like
together.
let's say you just broke a story, and you're trying to find out, okay, who was the source, and you go through the metadata and you're able to find out, oh, Shelley turns out she was talking to Lokman for the past 2 weeks, every day, 2 times a day, for a very long time. Okay. You don't need to know what was actually inside, the communication at that point, right? To have a suspicion that, oh, maybe Lokman was the source. The same thing when you're trying to make calls or email abortion clinics, phone calls to hospitals, and so on. Don't actually have to know what's inside, that kind of communication. It's enough to know that you just were doing those communications, right? And the same thing with geolocation, for example, right? That reveals a lot too. And so that also is metadata. Where you were, at what time, and so on. And so we have a quote actually from a national security advisor from the United States saying, just to show you that metadata actually is really, really critical. Like we kill people based on metadata. That's what they do with the drones. And then so, and I'm pointing this out because the whole idea of metadata is sort of is weird, because we created a category, metadata, because we assumed that this was less important information, right? The actual content is important, everything else is not. And so when you look at legal protections, for example, there are different criteria for what's actually inside the content and metadata. That's why we have this category distinction. But in the reality, has caught up, and reality right now, the metadata can be just as important, just as sensitive, if not more, than the actual content of the message sometimes. Having said that, so what app should I use? And this might change, of course, also. But there's a reason why I put Signal over WhatsApp and over Telegram. If you have to communicate with sources, Telegram provides end-to-end encryption, but it's optional. So you can choose to turn it on or off. So that's sort of like buying a box of condoms and putting it on your desk drawer, and then when you're actually doing the deed, you're looking at it and you're like, okay, should I use it or not? And the research shows that most of the time people are actually not, turning on the end-to-end encryption because it requires one more step, and most people don't do that. The opt-in versus opt-out is a very powerful mechanism. WhatsApp is a little bit better in that regard. WhatsApp doesn't give you a choice. It's always end-to-end encrypted. So when state actors go to WhatsApp or Facebook and say, hey, we want to know Shelley and Lokman were WhatsApping each other, they cannot say what was inside of the message. But they can say how often we talked, what time, where, and so on. Okay? So WhatsApp collects a lot of metadata. And there's been big controversies about, when there are plans to merge WhatsApp with Facebook, because that's exactly the kind of information they're interested in. Okay? So in that regard, Signal is sort of the best option from a technical point of view, because it's end-to-end encrypted, and it also collects the least amount of metadata in that regard.
I just want to interject on the WhatsApp. It also collects your past chat history if you don't turn that off, right? And then that's not encrypted.
It collects your chat history if you choose to store it in the cloud. So there's an option to say, I want to have a backup of my chat history. When you store that in the cloud, then what's in the cloud is not encrypted. So yeah, you're right about that too. Yes? I can't hear you.
If you do use Telegram and you opt in for the end-to-end encryption, how does that compare to Signal?
Then it's pretty good, But yeah, you just I'm not sure how much metadata Telegram collects, but I assume it's less than WhatsApp because WhatsApp has commercial reasons to collect it, and Telegram really doesn't.
And the question also would be: is this person you're talking to also encrypting, right?
Yeah, so it has to be from both sides.
From both sides.
It can only happen from both sides. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to go back, to what you said about Gmail. I mean, based on what you said, we shouldn't use Gmail then if it's not encrypted. So what email should
Gmail
you,
because my primary concern is Beijing.
Right. What email should you use?
I use Gmail because my primary concern is Beijing hacking into my accounts. I'm less concerned with the U.S. Government. So pick your poison in this regard. You can use email that is end-to-end encrypted, and that's called pretty good privacy, or equivalents of that. Those are technically quite challenging to use. Not a lot of people use it, and so I would not necessarily recommend that. Unless you have a very specific people you can work with and you can all agree on that. But for general usage, it's not really great at this point still. So when it comes to email, you really you need to you pick your poison. If you're comfortable with the U.S. government, then use Gmail. Yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question, but.
What about like a Proton mail?
Sorry?
Proton mail.
So Proton mail is pretty good, right? End-to-end encrypted. You have to pay for it. That's that's a barrier for a lot of people sometimes. Yeah.
Can I just ask you about with the Signal, the WhatsApp, and the Telegram? You've got the end-to-end encryption.
Please speak in the yeah.
Yeah, but you've got an issue with people using desktop apps for those now. Does that then open that up to being surveyed in a different way?
Yeah, so there are desktop versions, right, of these apps, right? So WhatsApp you can use on your desktop, Signal you can use on your desktop, Telegram you can use on your desktop. My answer to that is if they get access to your desktop, it's probably game over anyway. That's not. I mean, it's convenient. I would recommend using it, because you will use it more. And the point of these tools is to communicate more, not less, obviously. And if you're concerned that they get access to your desktop and then can read your message, then it's a similar issue to getting access to your phone, So obviously, you need to make sure you protect your desktop too. Last but not okay.
Sorry, just a quick one. A couple of years ago, I mentioned a product on an end-to-end, on a WhatsApp chat with someone, and then I logged into my Facebook, and that product flashed up as an advert on my Facebook. Is that a coincidence, or could that have been a keyword that's been taken out of WhatsApp and then used on Facebook as advertising?
That's probably pure coincidence,
okay.
Most likely, yeah. I love a good conspiracy theory, but yeah. And last but not least, pay for a good VPN. And I said pay, so don't use a free one, because. And what's a good VPN? That's a really, that's a really tricky question to answer, because there are no good sort of accreditation services of VPN at this point. But the one I can sort of talk about the ones I use or I trust. So F-Secure is one that I use. F-Secure, yeah, Freedom is called. I trust those people, but that's really just my personal. F-Secure, Freedom. So Freedom with an E attached to it. Yeah. There are a lot of VPN services out there, and so it's a bit of, and they keep changing all the time too. But you wanna, yeah. Talk with me after if you're really interested in this question. I can point you to some resources that help you decide which one is good and so on. Some caveats while I'm giving you these tips. So these tips should apply to most people, and they're the most important. I think they're some of the more important ones. But there's a much longer list of tips that I should be giving you that I'm not giving you right now because otherwise, would not fit within this 1 hour. And so one thing actually that came up earlier was, never use someone else's charger to charge your phone, or don't use the ones that like public ones that and so on. It's very easy to make sure that your data gets intercepted when that happens. So there's really no one-size-fits-all security tips. Like these apply for sort of quote-unquote regular journalists. If you travel often across borders, that's a completely different case scenario. Because sort of at the borders, completely different set of rules apply. And when you travel and you work often in China, of course, that's a completely different story then too. Also, this stuff gets dated fast, and it's often not timely. So, meaning I'm not giving you right now what you need when you need it, because you probably don't need it now. And it's really important that you get stuff when you need it at a timely point. Last but not least, prevention is good, but also have a plan in case for when you actually do get hacked. And so, from a practical point of view, that probably means trying to leave as little stuff on your phone as possible. And so, you probably need to save and archive stuff for defamation purposes from your news organization lawyer. But don't keep it on your phone. Like once you're done with it, maybe store it in your, on your desktop in your office, so that it doesn't fly anywhere. And when you lose it, like it's a big deal. Last but not least, digital security is kind of like a public health issue, in the sense that it's a social issue. It's something that we, affects all of us. And if you're the only one that practices good digital security and everyone else around you is lousy, you're just as screwed. And so. This is why having a talk like this is really important, so that we make sure everyone is covered, and not that the good ones that are already good at it are good, but we need to raise the bottom really on this issue. So here's a provocation, and it's something I talked with Shelley when she asked me for this talk. I said, this is actually not that helpful if you care about digital security. It's like this one-off workshop where in an hour, where I give you tips that are not very timely, that I'm not there actually to help you through, to get it, working on your phone and so on, and that's because digital security is not just about knowledge, knowing what you need to do. It's not even skills, knowing how to do it, but it's really ultimately about changing behavior, it's really kind of like safe sex in that regard. You need to know, you need to use a condom. You probably know how to use it too, but it doesn't mean that people use it, right? And then so, this happened in 2013. Just to remind you, pretty much every major international and American news organization got hacked by the Chinese, or at least at that point they were willing to share with the world that they were getting hacked, more like. And I remember it was the New York Times that first came out, I forgot. And then everyone else was like, oh yeah, we got hacked too. And the problem here is, of course, that talking about it is sort of embarrassing, right? It's a taboo, which helps the attacker, because the more we talk about it, the better we can protect ourselves. So this was in 2013. I was interested, after the umbrella movement, what's the state of digital security like in the Hong Kong media landscape? So I did some research, and this is research from interviews I did with journalists and managers and people working in Hong Kong news organizations. This was done in 2016, 2017. Hopefully, if I would do it today, it would be better. But the basic findings is that the state of digital security in Hong Kong newsrooms, has quote unquote, and this is very politically correct, has room for improvement. And there's poor support for digital security from the news organization. Not only is it poor support, sometimes the news organization actively sort of working against the reporter trying to improve their own digital security. It makes it difficult for the reporter to actually improve their own digital security. And there's the sort of the good news is there's a wide range of skill sets and mindsets, meaning the ones that are good are really good. And those are the ones that often have to work in travel to China, for example. But the ones that are bad are also really, really bad. And the norm is really this mindset called security by obscurity, and I'll talk about what that means. This is a quote from a manager, actually, editor level, and he says, when asked about, do you work, on any sensitive and so on, I have no such experience before. I don't think I have any secrets. I'm not a target for hacking, so it's something I just don't worry about. Here's another quote. There's no big issue in Hong Kong. I don't think there is any. So again, this was in 2016, 2017. I hope at this point that mindset is changing now. I think there are big issues now in Hong Kong when it comes to reporting in the news. But this is the idea. The security by obscurity is the idea that I don't need to practice digital security because I don't work on anything sensitive. Okay, so by being obscure, that's sort of the protection that they, think they have, right? And in my head, I'm like, if you're not working on anything sensitive, then what are you doing as a reporter? But okay, that's another issue that I. Anyway, so here's an example of someone who is much more tuned into security issues. So, and here you can also see the tension with higher level management about these kind of things. And so this person said, sometimes your boss jokes that even if the Chinese government does not read your message, the American government does, So why care, right? It's sort of the implicit assumption here. You think they don't read your Gmail? And then the reporter said, yeah, I would say yes, but I'd much rather they be read by the American government, just what I just said, actually. Or that Kakao, which is the messaging app that this reporter used, just being watched by the Korean government. I have no problem with that. I just don't want things to be read by the Chinese government. So what you see here is sort of a much more nuanced way of thinking about security already. Not sort of fatalistic idea of, they can see everything, therefore we don't have to do anything, right? We don't have to make it easy for them. That's one way of thinking about it, and there are ways to protect yourselves, even though there are no perfect ways to protect yourselves. Here's another example, maybe a little bit extreme, but this sort of shows you the length people go to sort of figure out how to do this well. And so we try our best to avoid phone calls and emails, and it's now much easier than before it is because of 3G and 4G. We used to use Gmail, so you now know that since it was heavily cracked down, this person obviously also operates in China. We switched to instant messaging systems. We don't have to use emails now anymore, and so on and so on. So what you see is that they don't blame this on resources, because a lot of people say, we don't have the money for that, or we don't have the research for that. But this reporter said, no, it's the awareness. They just don't get this stuff. And look, because resources will be provided after an attack. But obviously, you don't want to wait with putting locks in your house after you get, burglarized, right? So you want to put them in before. And then so the question then is, what kind of support do they get from news organizations? I said, the support is poor. And here are one or two quotes that I prepared to show you how. So in my opinion, one thing, they would not set up a VPN for the China reporting teams. Some do have it, but we don't. And even if they set up one, it doesn't work really well, and I just end up buying my own. This person, if I remember correctly, had like 5 different VPNs. and it was sort of like musical chairs, because on any given day, one might work better than the other, and they would just rotate it. So yeah, more examples of VPN. We use our own. We don't trust the company IT department. So this is where the IT department actually is actively sort of working against the reporter, trying to do better reporting. Really, that's what it's about. Not just to practice more digital security, but to do better reporting. And this reporter paid VPN out of his own pocket. The company won't pay you for these things, which also I think is insane when you think about it. So let's talk about an example that actually went really well when it comes to digital security and journalism. And so the Panama Papers is a really good example of news organization journalists coming together, protecting their sources, protecting confidentiality, and still getting amazing work done. And so this is, over 400 journalists worked together, over 120 news organizations, across borders. And they were successful in protecting the source. They were successful in protecting access to documents from attackers. They were successful in preventing early disclosure so that nothing was leaked beforehand. And so they were successful in keeping the entire project confidential and secret, and it was a project of a massive scale. And so this can be done. This is based on research where they surveyed the people. And so before they worked on the Panama Papers project, almost half had never used two-factor authentication, and almost half had never used PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, which is the end-to-end encryption email that we talked about. And after the project, everyone used it. And then more than half said security compliance actually is fairly easy at that point. So this goes to your earlier question, like when you work with a close group, then, like setting up end-to-end encryption email works because, you know who you're talking to, like you can mandate it, you can say, you can provide support and so on. And so if you care about press freedom, which, I hope we all care about in this room, you need to care about digital security. That's really what I'm hoping to get across here. It's not just a preventive defensive maneuver. It's an offensive maneuver. It allows you to do stories that you otherwise would miss out on. And so the Panama Papers is a great example of that. Like it's a story that would never have been able to take place if it wasn't for the immense great digital security that they practiced. And another example of how digital security allows you to cover stories that you otherwise would miss out on is the gentleman in the background there, Edward Snowden. I don't know how many of you know that story, but Edward Snowden, I assume you know Edward Snowden. But what Edward Snowden did was he was reaching out to Glenn Greenwald, who, I think at the time was working for The Guardian, and wanted him to break the story. Edward Snowden obviously was super careful about his identity and about his traces, and so when he approached Glenn Greenwald, he said, you need to install all this stuff before I can talk to you, before I can send you all my material, right? That included PGP, that included like Secure OS, and so on and so on. Glenn Greenwald had no idea who he was and what he was talking about, so he left that for half a year, lying there. And it wasn't until Edward Snowden approached Laura Poitras, who later ended up making the documentary about Edward Snowden, asking Laura, hey, is Glenn actually interested in my stuff? That then Laura went to Glenn Greenwald and say, hey, you really need to install this stuff and make it work because, like this guy wants to contact you. And so Glenn Greenwald would have potentially missed out on the story of his life if he didn't know how to use digital security. So the lesson here is don't wait until, you want to have it ready and you want to get it going, and and you don't want to wait until someone reaches out to you before you learn how to use this stuff.
What about the flip side? What about sources who don't know or won't necessarily want to download new software and apps and stuff? How do you educate your sources?
Well, here's where I'm the professor, and I'm saying, well, you should teach the source too to use that, right? And I realized that for most people, like they're trying to get the work done as fast as possible. The source might be have no idea how this works. The source might not even be near you. You might be over the phone, and so on and so on. And then so I understand that there are difficulties, but the right thing would be really to educate the source. You need to do this, and in the long run, I would say that gives you a good reputation too, that you really care about your sources. And that's what, like one or two anecdotal stories I got from the interview data that I got from the earlier research, like when the reporter teaching the source, hey, you need to use this, like they later realize, hey, you're doing that to protect me.
Sure, go ahead. Oh, hold on.
Thank you. I'm Emily La. Very stupid question. How do you know you have been hacked? I mean, if the thing operates normally, can it also have been hacked? Or would there be something that happened that oh, bam, I've been hacked?
It's not a stupid question. It's a great question.
And the other question is, sometimes when people have meetings and they are very worried about, people eavesdropping in, so they say, oh, collect all your phones, wrap it up with foil, or put it in the oven, or put it in the refrigerator next door. Does it really help? Thanks.
So the first question is, how do I know my phone is hacked? There really is no good way to know, which is a real problem today. And there's no perfect. Let me answer that. Let me change the answer a little bit. There's no perfect way to know it. There are ways to know it if you know what to look for sometimes, but not all the time. For example, there's something called zero-day attacks that hackers make. It means, and these are worth a lot of money, and it means that 0 day means that there have been no fixes for it yet, and that's why they're so valuable. And then so in that case, even Apple maybe doesn't know about that security leak, right? And so they only know about it once that it's being spotted in the wild. Those are not super common, and there's a reason why they cost up to $1 million at this point. And so that doesn't mean that you should be paranoid. You should be paranoid, but what you should be doing is, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't protect yourself, because, I can protect anyway. Because the point is to make it as expensive as possible for the attacker to really hack into you. Right? We all win if it costs each of them $1 million to hack our phones. And then so, because right now, the spear phishing attacks are super, super cheap, right? And then so we need to raise the cost for that at this point. But yeah, there are no perfect ways to know, which is a problem. So, for example, if you bring a device, so one thing I would not do is I would not bring my device if I'm traveling to China.
I have a specific question on that. By the way, there's a great book called
Countdown to 0 Day on 0 Day Attacks. It's a great book. But on traveling to China, or your airplane mode, let's say here, if airplane mode turns off the emissions, right? We're not emitting at all, but is our phone still collecting geodata that can then be hacked later?
That seems to be theoretically the case. I need to sort of really look into that for you. I'm happy to look at that. I'm not 100% sure on the answer to that.
Thanks.
The second question about putting your phones in the fridge, that actually works. So if you don't want, So because ideally you want to take out your battery, but the iPhone doesn't allow you to take out the battery. So then you want to put it in a bag and put it all in the freezer.
Well, they can eavesdrop.
They can't eavesdrop, he's saying.
Well, if you turn it off, and
But I mean, if your phone is if your phone is on, people can listen into your conversation. That's what Snowden.
supposedly not in if you put it in the freezer.
Because Ewan McCaskill.
I actually haven't tested that.
Yeah. When
but
Ewan
that's-
McCaskill interviewed, he was with Potras and Greenwald
Okay.
at the Mira.
I stand corrected.
And he walked in with his iPhone, and Snowden said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he did what Emily said. he switched his phone off and he put it in the freezer in the mini bar in the room next door to
Why
Snowden.
can't you just turn it off?
Sorry?
Why can't you just turn it off? Why do you have to put it in the freezer?
Because if the battery is still in there,
Oh.
it will still operate on some level.
I see. Got a question over here?
If you assume your phone has been compromised at some point and you still have it, so you buy a new phone and then you want to download some apps that you use all the time, something like Gmail or something like WhatsApp, does the compromised phone status migrate to the new one?
It depends on how the compromise has happened. If it, your phone is your phone is compromised can mean different things, right? So if it was compromised because they got access to your WhatsApp login information, right? Then moving to a new phone doesn't really help, right? Because they still know how to log into your WhatsApp. This, by the way, is also why you want to have WhatsApp also has two-factor authentication. So this is also why you want to turn that on then. Because with two-factor authentication, even if they get access to your password, they can't log into your account. And this is why two-factor is important. But yeah, it depends on how how you got compromised. I want to quickly go through this because I think this is actually important. Okay, so here are a couple of things I think will help improve digital security from a behavioral point of view rather than technical tips. And so this is especially important if you run a newsroom. So one is you want to reduce cognitive load for digital security, meaning you want to make it as easy as possible for people to do it. You don't want them to make constant decisions all the time. You want to be able to facilitate your people to be able to get timely support, when they need it, not at a one-off workshop like this. You want to cultivate a culture of security. That's something that the Panama Papers really, there was a lesson learned from Panama Papers. And then what I'm asking you also, because you're already on the frontier of this, you're already one of the better ones. I'm asking you to be the internal advocates for better security policies within your own organization. Reducing cognitive load, that means making security routine so you don't have to think about it. Don't wait until you get hacked to do these things, right? And so that includes, for example, mandating two-factor, mandating end-to-end encryption. And that's what happened in the Panama Papers. They just mandated it. They said, if you want to work on this project, that's what we need you to do. It was maybe a pain at the beginning when they had to learn it, but then after that it was routine. Everyone used it, and a large majority said this was easy. Provide timely support. If you run a newsroom, if you probably have a media lawyer on staff or at least external counsel, right? Where people can go to if they have questions about copyright or defamation and so on. In this day and age, any newsroom really should have a digital security expert, either in-house or externally, where people just can go to if they have questions. Most of the people I talk to for my interviews, not all, but most had a person, that they would go to for advice. But that, again, that means that the good ones get better, but the ones that don't have a clue, are left behind. And this is a public health issue. This is a social issue. We're all stronger if everyone, we need to raise that bottom again. And so you can manage the quality of the advice much better if like your newsroom appoints someone, and it's a lower cost for everyone, and everyone is better off because of that. Last but not least, cultivate this culture of security. Break the taboo. Like when things go bad, don't be embarrassed about it. Be open about that. When all the news organizations did in 2013, just say, hey, we got hacked. Here's what we do. Maybe do a postmortem too. Like what you learned. Also tell success stories. So that's important. Like the Panama Papers. It's not just a negative, pessimistic story, right? There are things we can do well too, and we need to celebrate that. And last but not least, something that I learned when I talk to journalists. The way a lot of journalists work is, when they try to figure out what to do and how to do it is by looking at people around them. Oh, I do this because everyone else is doing it. I think it's safe because everyone else is doing this. So what that means is you want to provide a lot more transparency about how people are actually doing their digital security, so that other people can see, in the news organization, everyone else is doing it too. And then award good behavior. So one thing that one person I talked to, one new organization I talked to experimented with was a dashboard, a leaderboard, for people that reported the most phishing attempts, for example. So you reward that behavior. You show that everyone else you're a good citizen, and a good and so on.
I think we have a question over here real quick.
Topical. The hacking on Hong Kong journalists, is it done by the Hong Kong government or the Chinese government?
They didn't tell me that kind of detail, so, but yeah. But the ones that traveled to China, obviously that was the Chinese government, yeah.
If you were traveling across the border, would you just suggest leaving your phone in Hong Kong, or bringing
So
a
I would
separate
bring
phone?
clean devices, yeah. I would leave your own device. And so this is also something the newsroom can do. Make it easy for everyone just to have clean devices that they can come in and grab, and then after they come back, you just wipe the thing, and yeah.
And what about just bringing your phone on airplane mode?
Same. I mean, I really wouldn't bring it, because even if you bring an airplane, there's a physical access, and so yeah.
The whole clean device thing is interesting because there's been, a couple of incidents in Canada of lawyers entering the country with their laptops, refusing to open them for immigration searches, and then having their laptops taken away from them.
So when you're at the borders, it's a completely different story. And it depends on the specific country and the immigration rules. But most places, they at this point reserve the right to ask you for that. And you can refuse, but then you don't get in.
I think we're starting to run out of time. Was there a last slide that you had with some resources on there?
Sorry?
Was there a last slide you had with some resources that you wanted to put up?
Yeah. So I just wanted to share one more anecdote because I think this one is funny. So with the Eternal Advocate for Better Security Policies, this was a reporter that trying to convince their boss, their management, that they really needed to change the security on their Wi-Fi. And they were like, nah, that's not important. No, we don't care about that. So what he ended up doing was he actually hacked into the own Wi-Fi to show, hey, you really need to change this. So I'm not saying, you should go to this kind of length to be the internal advocate for security policies. There probably are less adversarial ways to do that. But sometimes, this is, the kind of length people have to go to say, hey, this is something we really need to care about. So I want to sort of end a little bit on a positive note, because, we're constantly under the idea that press freedom is under threat, and, that's obviously is the case. But we also forget that sometimes this is something we can all do something about, and it's something we can exercise, and it's kind of like a muscle almost, like if we don't exercise it, the muscle doesn't become strong. And if we don't exercise, it becomes weak, and so on. And so digital security, seen as a press freedom issue, means that this is something we can do, improve, work on day in, day out. And that's what a lot of the, not a lot, some of the reporters that I talked to for my interviews really thought about this way. That's why they thought it was important. I'm a good academic, so I'm showing the references. And there's a lot more guides out there. There are actually a million guides out there. Some of them are more dated than others. These are because I know the people that make them. That's the and so I trust these people. But that doesn't mean that they're actually perfect. They're not. They're good starting points for you, but they're not specifically for journalists. It's on my to-do list to make one at some point, but doing my best. But these are good starting points for if you want to know more, Security Planner is really easy. The Security Planner asks you to answer a few questions, and then they will give you some recommendations on how you can improve your security. But it's really for a general audience, not for journalists specifically. But you're also a normal person, right? So you might as well do that too. And then the last one is a guide to digital security that has basically a long list of stuff that you can do on top of the ones that I already gave you. Thank you, and we'll take more questions, or do we have time for more questions?
I think we're running out of time, but Lokman will be around for a few minutes if
Sure.
you guys have any more questions for him. And we will continue to do these breakfast briefing workshops as the protests continue. If any of you guys have any suggestions of resources or things that you want to see the FCC do, please find me or Eric or anyone else at the FCC and give them your suggestions. And thank you so much for waking up early to come out. Thanks.